I bought a plot of land in a small country town 4 years ago and left it there, idle, without touching anything. But when I decided to go back and check on it, I was startled. On my land, where before there was nothing but scrubland, there were now 100 brand new houses, all occupied by residents who had no idea who I was. I've never been the type to invest in real estate with the intention of building straight away. I bought that piece of land 4 years ago in a quiet little town, one of those places that seem to stand still in time. The idea was simple: leave it there, let it appreciate in value, and one day decide what to do with it. Until then, I didn't even worry, because it was my space and no one was going to touch it. At least, that's what I thought. During that time, I simply forgot that the land existed. Life happened. Work, routine, travel, and before I knew it, I hadn't even been near that town for 4 years. Then, one afternoon, I decided it was time to see what was left of my piece of land. I expected to find high weeds, maybe some little animal taking over the space. Maybe a neighbor had dumped rubble there. There's always a funny person who treats vacant lots as garbage dumps. But what I found was surreal. It wasn't just overgrown bushes or rubble. On my plot of land, where before there was just empty land, there was now an entire neighborhood. Houses, paved streets, traffic signs, even playgrounds, as if that piece of land had been swallowed up and spat back out like a magazine condominium. I stopped the car and just stared for a few minutes, trying to absorb the scene. The shock was such that my mind went into a state of denial, as if I was in the wrong place, as if the GPS had thrown me off and I was freaking out by mistake. But no, the street, the landmarks, everything matched. It was my land. But now, there were people living on it, and that's when she appeared. The woman appeared out of nowhere, like an NPC programmed to approach you at just the right moment. A lady in a blazer who shouted, "I have power here," and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you lost?" she asked, with that sympathy that only disguises the desire to send you away. I opened my mouth, but it took me a few seconds to remember how to speak. I was still in too much shock. I looked to one side, to the other, checked one more time to make sure it was my property, and then I let out the first thing that came to mind. "What is this?" She laughed, as if the question was absurd. "Welcome to our beautiful community. The HOA has worked hard to turn this space into a home for many families." The HOA, the fucking Homeowners Association. That's when my mind snapped. These bastards not only took my land, they decided to stick an entire condominium on it without ever telling me. And now this woman was talking as if she had done humanity a favor. My vision blurred with anger, but I took a deep breath. Making a fuss wasn't going to solve anything. I needed to understand the situation better before I acted. But one thing was certain. This was mine, and someone was going to have to pay me handsomely for this stunt. I needed to process everything calmly. But how do you stay calm when you find out that a bunch of lunatics have just taken your land and built 100 houses without asking permission? I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip down that "Welcome to the Community" sign and stick it on the wall of the nearest house. But I held back. Still, that woman, who I already knew was the president of the HOA, was still standing there, smiling as if she was trying to sell the idea that everything was beautiful and wonderful, as if I were just another potential resident interested in buying a piece of my own land. "And how much does it cost to live here?" I asked, crossing my arms, trying to hide the anger in my voice. She smiled even more. The kind of smile that only someone who has fooled a lot of people knows how to give. "Well, prices vary, but all the units sold quickly. The houses were so well located that it didn't take us long to find buyers. And of course, the HOA ensures that everything here works perfectly." How wonderful. "So as well as taking my land, you've also made a profit by selling the houses you've built on it? That's perfect. It only got better." I felt my blood boil, and I had to concentrate not to send that woman to a place that even the GPS couldn't find. I looked interested. If there's one thing I've learned in life, It's that people talk too much when they think they're in control. And how long has this condominium been here? She looked up at the sky, as if she was going through the archives of her own mind. I think about 3 years. The project was quick, you know? We had support from many fronts. The residents were so happy. 3 years. 3 years. In other words, less than a year after I bought the land, these sickos decided that it was going to shit and started building houses as if it were all theirs. Without looking for me, without even pretending to want to negotiate. They just took over as if I didn't exist. And worse, nobody noticed. And how did this process go? Did you buy the land from someone? I continued, already sensing that the answer was going to give me more hatred than satisfaction. The woman hesitated. The first crack in the facade of false security appeared in her smile. Ah, well, it was a long bureaucratic process, you know? Lots of paperwork, but it all worked out in the end. Translation: they stole it and hoped no one would notice. I see, I replied, trying to sound casual. And who sold you the land? Now she was uncomfortable. Oh, those details are a thing of the past. What matters is that we now have a beautiful, functional neighborhood. Right. She clearly knew something was wrong. Maybe she'd been fooled too, but I doubted it. She seemed very comfortable in the role of villain. I had heard enough. The only thing holding me back was the growing desire to turn that HOA into a case study of how to destroy a neighborhood association in the most humiliating way possible. But I needed proof. I got back in the car and drove to the city clerk's office. It was a small place, with yellowed walls and the smell of old paper that only places like this have. I explained my situation to the clerk, who looked at me as if I'd just told her I'd found a UFO in my backyard. Are you saying there's a condominium built on your land? Yes, and I want to know who the hell signed anything that allowed it. She entered some data into the system, checked physical records, and, after about 20 minutes, handed me a folder. I started reading and felt my soul leaving my body. It was worse than I had imagined. The land was still registered in my name. It had never been sold. There was never a purchase contract. The HOA simply took over the land as if it belonged to them and went about building. It was an Olympic-level scam. They probably counted on the idea that the owner would never come back, would never find out, or they thought they could make up some excuse when the time came. And now they were going to pay. Very expensive. I left the registry office holding those papers as if they were golden tickets to the perfect revenge. My name was still there. Legally, that land was still 100% mine. And what did that mean? Simple. Every one of those houses built without my permission was now mine too. I sat in the car and laughed to myself for a good few minutes. The HOA dug its own grave. They'd spent 3 years thinking they were clever, selling houses they could never sell. And now they were about to take a reality hit that not even the best lawyers could fix. But before I dropped the bomb in their laps, I had to make sure it went off the right way. First step, a lawyer. I went home and made an appointment with a lawyer specializing in property disputes. The guy didn't even have to listen much. The moment I explained the basics, he was already rubbing his hands together with excitement. "You've got a golden case here," he said, leafing through the documents. "Not only did they use your property illegally, but they profited by selling real estate that legally still belongs to you. And what happens now?" He smiled. "Simple. We'll sue the HOA and everyone involved for trespass, misappropriation, and real estate fraud. What's more, since the land is yours and there has been no transfer of ownership, you can claim everything that was built there. In other words, I could evict every resident if I wanted to. Now, before anyone calls me a monster, let me explain. I didn't want to screw the residents. They were cheated just as much as I was. But the HOA? Those were the ones I wanted to destroy to the last brick. Step 2. The bomb explodes. My lawyer sent a formal notice to the HOA, informing them that the land was still mine and that they had committed a crime by building without authorization. The reaction was immediate. 2 days later, the president of the HOA The woman who welcomed me with a fake smile called me. I answered as calmly as I could. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice laced with despair. "Ah, now you've changed your tune, have you? It's not a misunderstanding. You built on my land without my permission and sold houses you couldn't sell. We can resolve this another way. Perhaps compensation," she suggested, trying to sound reasonable. Compensation? Now, the woman wanted to pay me some change and pretend everything was fine, after doing 100 houses without even asking me if I existed. "No," I replied, short and sweet. "We'll settle this in court." The panic in her voice was almost musical. She still tried to argue, but I just hung up. Step 3. The HOA nightmare begins. When the HOA received the court notice, it was absolute chaos. Residents started asking what was going on. What was once a perfect community turned into pandemonium. Some started looking for lawyers. After all, they had bought houses that technically belonged to me. The HOA tried to do damage control, but the damage had already been done. Reports began to circulate about the case, and the city council, which until then had pretended not to see anything, was forced to open an investigation into how that condominium was approved without proper ownership being transferred. Before long, there was evidence of forged documents, suspicious permits, and a lot of internal corruption. The entire HOA was involved in a gigantic real estate fraud scheme. And the best part? Each of those properties was worth a fortune, which meant that when the judge passed sentence, I was going to come out of this a millionaire. The trial was a spectacle worthy of being filmed. The courtroom was full, crammed with residents who until that moment had been comfortable in their homes without even imagining that they had bought properties built in a monumental scam. Some were still confused, trying to understand what was going on, while others were already pale, realizing the colossal shit they had gotten themselves into. But no one in that room was more screwed than the HOA president and her gang of incompetents, who now looked like cornered rats, with no way out and no excuses. The woman who had once welcomed me full of authority, talking about the beautiful work of the HOA, now looked like a specter of her former self. She was sweating, moving her hands non-stop, looking around as if she were looking for an invisible emergency door. But there was nowhere to run. The judge already had the documents on his desk, and his expression was one of pure disgust. My lawyer, who was clearly having more fun than he should have with the situation, made a point of recounting every detail of the scam, exposing the whole farce that the Residents Association had set up. It was clear that they had acted deliberately, that they had seen the empty lot, and decided they could just take it for themselves. It wasn't an innocent mistake. It wasn't a bureaucratic mess. It was theft. They knew they didn't have the rights to the land. They knew they were building on someone else's property. They knew they were profiting illegally by selling houses that weren't theirs. They just bet that I would never come back, that I would never notice. But I did, and now they were going to pay. When the judge finally banged his gavel, the sentence came like music to my ears. The HOA was officially dissolved. All those directly responsible would be criminally prosecuted for real estate fraud, embezzlement, and an endless list of financial crimes. But the best part came at the end. Since the land had always been mine, all the houses built on it now belonged to me. It was as if the world had stopped for a second. The silence in the courtroom was almost deafening. The horror on the faces of the residents was almost palpable. 100 houses, 100 families, 100 properties that were now in my hands. It was then that the real chaos began. The residents, who up until a few minutes earlier had just been watching the trial unfold, exploded in indignation. Many of them started shouting that this was absurd, that they had bought the houses in good faith, that they were not to blame for the HOA's incompetence. I understood their frustration, but the truth was one. Their problem wasn't with me. I wasn't the idiot who sold houses without having rights to the land. I wasn't the fraud genius who decided to build without authorization. If they had a problem, let it be with the HOA, or rather, with their lawyers. Some came to me personally, begging me not to evict them, asking if they could buy their houses back. But now the price was in my hand. They wanted the houses? Fine. But they were going to pay a lot more than they had before. Others simply accepted the disaster and started looking for somewhere else to live, leaving behind their hopes and, in some cases, even their furniture. Over the next few months, I started selling the houses one by one. As I was now the only legitimate owner of the land, I dictated the rules. Some people were willing to pay whatever it took not to lose their property, and I made sure to adjust the prices to reflect exactly the headache they had caused me. Other houses I sold to new buyers, making even more profit than the HOA could have dreamed of. And some I simply demolished. I didn't have to, of course. I could have sold them all. But I wanted, out of sheer personal satisfaction, to see the HOA's work turned into rubble. I chose the houses that bothered me the most, hired a demolition team, and, on a beautiful sunny day, watched as excavators reduced everything to dust. Every brick knocked down was a reminder that you can't build on someone else's property without paying a price. As for the former HOA president, well, her fall was even more fun to watch. After the trial, she was sued individually for fraud and embezzlement, had to sell her own house to cover part of the compensation, and, of course, lost all respect in the community. Residents who once treated her like a queen now saw her for what she really was, an arrogant scam artist who ruined the lives of dozens of people. The local newspapers loved the story. Headlines about the stolen condominium appeared everywhere. They discovered that the HOA had carried out several suspicious practices before, but never anything of this level. The scandal was so big that the city was forced to review all the permits they had given for the construction, resulting in a few more layoffs and corruption investigations within the city itself. I came out of it a millionaire. The money the HOA tried to make ended up in my pocket. The houses they sold were now mine to negotiate as I saw fit. And the sweetest thing of all? I didn't have to steal anything from anyone. The HOA bet that I would never come back, that I would never notice. They bet that they could build an empire without the real owner showing up to complain. But in the end, they only paved the way for me to leave with a fortune, and them to leave with nothing. Now, every time someone asks me if it's worth investing in land, I smile and say, it depends. You can buy one, forget about it for a few years, and when you come back, you might find that someone has built a city on it and made you a billionaire. And if you like this video, please comment and leave your like to support it more and more.